Now that we have learned about all of the new features in Android M, let's talk about how to develop your environment so you can begin developing Android apps. First, we'll go over the system requirements for developing on three main computer platforms: Windows, Mac, and Linux. If you're developing on Windows, you will have both software and hardware requirements. As far as software, you will need the latest version of the Windows operating system. As of the recording of this video, that is Windows 8.1. You can develop on older versions, but we recommend using the latest version. Windows 10 will work too, but we suggest waiting until it has been running stably for a few months. You will also need Java Development Kit version 7 installed. For hardware, you will want a minimum of 2 to 4 gigabytes of RAM. More RAM will result in higher performance. The Android application will use 400 megabytes of hard disk space, and the Android SDK will use 1 gigabyte of RAM, so a total of 2 gigabyte of disk space will be sufficient. You will need a minimum screen display resolution of 1280 by 800. If you're developing on the Mac operating system, you will have both software and hardware requirements. For software, it is recommended to use Mac OS X version 10.8.5 or higher. The latest version is 10.9 Mavericks. You will also need to install the Java Runtime Environment version 6 and the Java Development Kit version 7. For hardware, you will want a minimum of 2 to 4 gigabytes of RAM. More RAM will result in higher performance. The Android application will use 400 megabytes of hard disk space, and the Android SDK will use 1 gigabyte of RAM, so a total of 2 gigabytes of disk space will be sufficient. You will need a minimum screen display resolution of 1280 by 800. If you're developing on the Linux operating system, you will have both software and hardware requirements. For software, it is recommended to use the latest stable version of Linux version 3.15.5 with a GNOME or KDE desktop environment. Popular distributions like Ubuntu and Linux Mint provide these. You will need to install a GNU C library, glibc 2.15, to allow you to perform operations like read, open, print, or close commands. You will need to install the Java Development Kit version 7. For hardware, you will want a minimum of 2 to 4 gigabytes of RAM. More RAM will result in higher performance. The Android application will use 400 megabytes of hard disk space, and the Android SDK will use 1 gigabyte of RAM, so a total of 2 gigabytes of disk space will be sufficient. You will need a minimum screen display resolution of 1280 by 800. Since we're developing an Android application that will run on mobile devices like Android wearables, phones, tablets, TV, and Android Auto, we need to run and test these apps on these devices. If we are developing an application using Windows as our development platform, we have to install a USB driver for ADB, i.e. Android Debug Bridge, which will act as a bridge between the application and the device. This will allow Windows to detect the device once it's connected. So now we will show you how to install the USB driver on Windows. There are three ways to do this depending on how well Windows recognizes the device. 1. The automatic method. Connect the device to the system and it will find the corresponding device driver, download, and install it automatically. If this works, then you are done. 2. The manual method using the web. If not, go to the device manufacturer portal and download the driver file for your device model. 3. The manual method with driver file. Install the driver in your system and the system will detect the device if it's installed properly. As an example, say you're trying to install the device driver for a Samsung device. Connect the device to the system and it will download and install the device driver automatically. If it fails to download it, then go to method 2. Go to the device manufacturer portal as shown in the screenshot. You will get a .exe file as seen in the screen here. Download the device driver file, double-click, and install it on your system. There is good news if you're developing on Mac OS X. There is no configuration needed to get the system to recognize your device. You can directly install the application and it can run it and recognize your devices. If you're developing on a Linux platform, you have to add a module called UDEV to the configuration files. It contains a USB configuration for each type of device you want to use for development. We'll show you how to do this with an actual Ubuntu system. First log in as a root user and in the etc folder install a module called udev. Create a file named 51-android.rules in the etc/udev folder. First, we'll navigate to the /etc/udev/rules.d folder. Now create the file by typing the following command: nano space 51-android.rules. So the full path is /etc/udev/rules.d/51-android.rules. In the previous slide, we created the file, but it is still empty. We need to add the content that the system will use, that is, the USB configuration for each type of device you want to use for development. In this file, we're showing the configuration for 3 different devices. You will notice that the configuration for each device follows a certain format. Use this format to add each vendor to the file. Subsystem == attr ID vendor XXXX mode =0666 group =plugdev, where XXXX is the vendor ID for the particular device. You can find the appropriate vendor ID from this page: http://developer.android.com/tools/device.html #vendor-IDs. In our example, you can see the vendor ID equals 0BB4. You can see from the page above that this is the ID for an HTC device which is connecting to a Linux development machine via USB. So if you're running on Linux, you can now go ahead and finish creating the vendor configuration file to add USB support for your device. To save your file, press Ctrl-O, Enter. This will save your file. Now press Ctrl-X to exit the file. Now in order for this file to be able to be used, we need to set permissions on the file using the command chmod. Type the following command: chmod /etc/udev/rules.d/51-android.rules, and then press Enter to execute it. To check that the file has proper permissions, type the following command: ls-i/etc/udev/rules.d/51-android.rules, and then press Enter to execute it. You should get the following permissions as a result: -rw-r-r-r-. You have now created the necessary configuration file for Linux to be able to recognize your devices via USB. Android provides a very useful set of tools called developer options that allow you to debug your app and make it run more efficiently. You can access them right on the device, and they let you enable debugging over USB, quickly capture bug reports on the device, show CPU usage on the screen, draw debugging information on screen such as layout bounds, updates on GPU views, hardware layers, and other information, and simulate app stresses and enable debugging options. Devices running Android version 4.0 or above will have the developer options feature hidden by default. In the settings, there is an option to enable developer options. Once you enable it, you can select the various tools to help in debugging and optimizing your app. This concludes our discussion on setting up the Android development environment. We have covered the basic system requirements and environment setup procedures for creating an Android app, whether you're working on Windows, Mac, or Linux. We have also covered developer options that you can enable on your Android device to help in debugging and optimizing your app. We'll see you back here for our next session.